Welcome back to the Body Never Lies podcast. I feel like I've spent quite a bit of time talking about being overweight and having a high body fat percentage. But today I want to talk about what is actually healthy in terms of low body weight and achieving a low body weight. And I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of a coach and all of the women that I've worked with over 20 years, but also my own story of being very lean for a very, very long period of my life and how that has impacted me. And I also am really drawn to talk about it because I still have people who say to me, but my doctor said that the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is just be as low body weight as possible. And this is setting us up to fail in terms of our health. So let's dive into low body weight.
Welcome to The Body Never Lies. I'm your host, Leila Lutz. Each week, myself and experts from around the world help you uncover the secret ways your body communicates with you to empower you in your own individual health journey.
I mean, it's a really interesting concept, right? So we make an assumption that the unhealthy thing is body fat and that the less body fat you have, the more healthy you are. And it is true, as our body fat goes down, we do lessen various comorbidities. But at the same time, there are health implications for being low body weight. I will put up on my Instagram and in my newsletter a little guide as to what is a healthy body weight for different heights. Now, people are messaging me a lot lately about numbers and getting confused and overwhelmed with numbers. There are a lot of numbers that we can work with as coaches that are guidelines as to what someone's body composition should be, what their metabolic rate should be, what their caloric intake should be, et cetera, et cetera. They are guidelines. The human body is such a complex piece of physiology that reacts very differently to everybody else's body that we can just use these as guidelines. So I want to start, for instance, with talking about someone who's been in the media a lot, and that is who has a very large physique and large body composition, and that is the American rugby player, Alona Ma. And I think she's done an amazing job of shining a light on different body compositions and focusing on the capability of our bodies rather than the size of our bodies. But I want to draw attention to her because one of the things that she's grown up with is this problem where she was diagnosed as overweight by using BMI, so the body mass index, which is looking at your height and your weight. I can't remember the exact formula because I don't use it because it's absolutely null and void. But according to that formula, she always comes up as overweight. She's 5'11" and she weighs like 90 kilos, I think. When you look at her playing sport or on Dancing with the Stars, as she is right now, she has low body fat. Like she probably wouldn't be under 20%, but she's definitely probably 25% or less, which is perfectly healthy. She's just a very muscular woman and she's genetically predisposed to that, as she said. And what she did was she realized that her muscle was a gift on the sports field. And so she got into rugby. So I'm not saying that every woman who is that size needs to play sport. But when we're trying to help a client or you're trying to work out what your body composition should be, there's nuance to it and context. Alona Ma probably will never weigh anywhere near the recommended guidelines for her height, nor should she. And it would be catastrophic for her mental health and her health to force her to fit into the mold. And I have a client who actually is 5'11", and she is a bigger lady. And, I think when we were kids, everyone used to say, oh, I'm big boned. It was a joke. But some people do have a lot more mass in their musculoskeletal system more naturally. And this beautiful client of mine, unfortunately, at 5'11", and has always been tall and always on the bigger side, has been dieting since she was a child because of this whole idea of like BMI and it's not okay to be a bit bigger than the normal. And subsequently, from this dieting her whole entire life, that has been set up from the bar being set so low as to what weight she would be, we've had to do a lot of work together to unpack that. But also I sent her for a DEXA scan because I wanted her to see that she actually has a lot of mass, lean mass. So her lean mass, and we'll get into it when I talk about body mass and how to work out what's ideal for you, her lean mass was really, really high. So even as a coach, and that's without doing a lot of exercise. So as a coach, it's up to me to go, well, that is your natural makeup. It would be criminal of me to say that you should fit into the guidelines for your health. I would the recommended guidelines of weight according to your height for health reasons, because it simply wouldn't be true. I'd actually say that she probably needs to be 5 to 10 kilos heavier at a minimum than the guidelines. And we'll come back to that. So I think there's nuance to prescribing or giving someone an idea of what weight they should be. And then on the flip side of that, of course, we've got the people who sit under the guidelines. And I'm going to be really honest here and say, I am yet to meet someone who sat under the recommended weight guidelines for their height and did it in a healthy way. I'm yet to meet someone who did it. I'm happy for someone to come forward and say, after I've done this podcast and listen to what I have to say on it, and maybe like, I've met all the guidelines that you say, Leila, and I do sit under that weight. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but it would be a very small amount of people who would fit underweight from the guidelines. So I'm going to take me for example, right? We'll use me as an example. I'm 5'9". The recommended weight for my height is around 63 to 68 kilos. I always, my whole entire life, weighed 56, 57, 58 kilograms. My whole adult life, like from about the age of 16. At some points in my life, I weighed 52 kilograms, which was after very stressful events and not being able to eat. But anytime I really pushed the nudge over 60, I didn't like the way I physically looked. Or I would look in the mirror and think I'm quite soft and squishy, so I must need to lose weight. Now, I had a small stint of a career as a model, which further cemented this idea in my brain that I needed to look that way. And even though I went and studied nutrition, I never really looked at myself as needing nutrition guidance because I wasn't overweight. And to be honest, what was really taught to us was how to help people lose weight and how to restrict calories because of this idea that being lean is really healthy, healthier than being overweight, for example. And I would say this is probably the biggest undoing of my health. Absolutely. Now, I never tried to be underweight. I actually grew up in a house where we didn't have enough money to have enough food. And I was always hungry and I was always asking my mum for more food. And she was just like, well, there isn't any. And so I just had this low body weight because I never ate enough as a child. We were both really skinny. And my mum's GP, our family GP, solution to that was to give us more of a Western diet. So going from an Asian diet to a Western diet, so having things that were more affordable like Wheat Bix and cereals and things like that, which didn't agree with me. I mean, I remember I used to have like 3 white bread sandwiches for lunch. And we were told that we were too skinny. My mum was worried we were too skinny, but he gave us ideas that were processed and made us feel sicker. So we sort of came to the conclusion that we were meant to be that low body weight. But the thing is as well, my poor mother has a lot of trauma around food and the guilt of having more food than other people around her. And so that was passed on to me as well, is, not to be greedy. But when I look at myself, I could go out on a weekend or we could go to a family friend's barbecue and I could eat so much food, and I would. I would absolutely pig out when I went to a barbecue or something. And I now understand that, having been educated but worked with thousands of women, that is actually a binge restrict cycle, because you get so hungry from restricting and then all of a sudden there's all this food around you, so you eat a ton. And what that appears to people on the outside is like, well, Leila eats so much food, but she's so skinny. She must just have high metabolism. And all it is just giving yourself a bit of a diet break, really. So I don't put on weight, because then come Monday I would go back to eating very low calories again. And this is a cycle that continued through most of my life. And then when I went to university, I studied really hard and I wanted to get away from my family circumstances, away from relying on government assistance and living on that side of the socioeconomic scale. And I pushed myself so hard study-wise and working multiple part-time jobs and opening my own business while working multiple part-time jobs. And I was very much entrenched in this adrenaline-fueled busyness and achievement. And that was really praised in my family as well. And so along went my undereating for all of my 20s. And of course, I got into fitness training and strength and conditioning and so on. And I kept increasing my output the more exercise I was doing, but not increasing my intake in terms of calories. And so it's no wonder at the age of 27 that I had a total burnout and collapsed and ended up in a cardiac ward, and then went down the path of having tons and tons of issues that were never ever really got to the root cause of, because nobody ever asked me how much food I ate. And most people assume really that eating 1,800 calories, 2,000 calories for a person is a healthy amount of food. Where in fact, when I look back at the output that I was putting out and the amount of exercise I was doing, because I would do my own workouts, but I would also be on my feet all day, and then I would run with some clients and I would be lifting weights and packing them away and carrying them around the gym. And, I really, really should have been eating probably 3,000 calories, and that was never brought to my attention. And so part of me doing this podcast today is this is something I'm so passionate about, and it really grinds my gears, even just talking about it sometimes, because we all have this perception that being skinny is the be all and the end all. Being skinny is healthier than being fat. I hope you realize from the podcast that I did recently, do you really need to lose weight right now? It is actually possible to be very strong, very fit, and very healthy at a higher body fat percentage, like up to 30%. And just because someone has 30% body fat does not mean that they are more unhealthy than someone who is at 20% body fat. When they are fit, they are strong, they eat good, healthy foods, they can actually be a lot healthier than someone at 20% body fat. So I want to talk about what happens when we eat that little, because the truth is most people who sit at 20% body fat are under eating. And like I said before, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen someone that sits that low unless they're an athlete and they are fueling performance. But the general population who like that skinny look, that model kind of size 6, 8 Australian, size 2 US, size 0 to US, they're definitely under eating. And it's actually getting worse in my age group as well. And we'll explain that why as well. But one of the things that happens when you eat less. And I encourage you guys to really look at the podcast, listen to the podcast or watch the YouTube series that the Strong Sisters did with Kathleen Stewart on the Minnesota starvation experiment. The Minnesota starvation experiment was researching what to do with returned soldiers from war because there's such a high rate of low calorie intake with soldiers from being prisoners of war, from being out in the battlefield. And they were noticing that when these men came back and they just started eating normal food again, they actually came up with a whole lot of health issues. And so they were experimenting on a group of men to try and work out how to basically refeed them and also research what health issues that came up. So they took a group of men, and these men were all eating around 3,500 calories a day. And they took them into what they called starvation, but a lot of us call it pseudo-starvation because they were eating still like 1,700, 1,800 calories, which is more than most people eat on a diet these days. And what they noticed with over time, I think it was like 12 weeks, 24 weeks, yes, the men all lost a lot of weight, but they also came up with a lot of health issues. And all of the health issues that they came up with are the challenges that I see with my clients today. And that is because we've got to this point where we just believe that eating less than 2,000 calories is normal. And it's being pushed even more with like the Ozempic thing because when you're on Ozempic, you just don't feel like eating. So people are getting into these low calorie states very easily and very quickly. And yes, of course, like in these days, we're talking World War II here, people were a lot more active. And so you would assume that 3,500 calories is an adequate amount of food because of the amount of activity that people do. But generally that people come to see me, they're not sedentary. They're people who know they need to go to the gym. They know that they need to get steps in. And quite often the people that I work with are the ones that are deemed as people who are overtraining. And what I would say is actually most people are not overtraining. They're actually under-recovering and under-eating. And this is why it's really important to look at this. So what they noticed with these people, and any actual, like a lot of prisoners of war and Holocaust victims doing autopsies on these people, is not only do you lose fat mass, but you also lose a ton of skeletal mass, your muscles, but not just your muscles, you lose mass in your organs. So your intestines can shrink like 30 to 40%. Your liver can shrink even more than that. So when the body goes into starvation, it goes into a preservation mode where it slows down the energy consumption as well. And it will stop feeding the organs. It will just give it the minimum effective dose to keep going. So can you imagine like your intestinal wall, your intestines is a muscle and its job is to contract to move the stool along, but its job also is to absorb nutrients through the intestinal wall. Now, in these states of pseudo-starvation, the intestinal wall actually becomes thinner and more permeable. And so they were seeing things like leaky gut and all sorts of other gut issues from the lack of food. And this is a huge thing I see with people. I see more gut issues in people with low body weight or people who've done a lot of caloric restriction or cut out major food groups because the intestinal wall is part of the musculoskeletal system. It needs energy and it needs density. It needs, to be a large muscle. So when you are starving it, it decreases in size and it massively decreases in function. And I'm working with so many people who have gut issues and nobody has ever asked them, okay, how much do you eat? No one ever has talked to the implication of, yes, okay, you may find certain foods irritating, like fiber, starch, but do you realize what happens over a long time when we reduce those foods and we don't make up for the calories in other ways, that we actually slow down gut motility even more. And when gut motility slows down, what happens is you actually get more stool and more matter sitting in the gut for longer periods of time. And so then we get the overgrowths of bacteria. And we're not getting the right digestive enzymes to promote the right bacteria because we don't have the energy to make digestive enzymes. And then, like I said before, the leaky gut can just come from the intestinal wall being a under-muscled wall and thus more permeable. And so then we start getting food matter seeping through the tiny junctures into the intestinal wall and then causing autoimmune issues, etc. So it's really telling when people tell me that they alternate between diarrhea and constipation, and this was really common in the Minnesota starvation experiment, or they have constipation or gut issues just from the lack of food. So the same thing happens with your liver. Like your liver is a battery pack. Your liver's job is to store glycogen for, especially at nighttime, to use that glycogen and it also breaks down cholesterol, it breaks down estrogen, and it needs energy to do all those things. It needs glucose to make the conversion of inactive thyroid hormone to active thyroid hormone. So one can only imagine when your liver's like shrunk 40-50% that its capacity is going to be altered. And this is what else is common in this group of low weight body people is the constant need to do detoxification. So gut cleanses and liver cleanses and having blood sugar handling issues because the liver is low in glycogen, having thyroid issues, all of these things that can be attributed to a lack of food. So when you think of this, all of your organs shrinking as well, this is what contributes to the low body weight as well. And this is why we need to really look at someone's body weight when they're underweight and question, is that really healthy? Because if they're suffering from gut issues, thyroid issues, all these kinds of issues, it could just be from the lack of food and the organs underfunctioning because of that lack of energy coming in, and them being undersized is what's contributing to the low body weight. So let's say, for instance, when I was 57, 58 kilos, I have a DEXA scan here. When I was 57, 58 kilos, I had 43 kilos of lean mass, 43 kilos. And at the time, I was one of those people that just had gut issues. I was always doing digestive cleanses, but I thought it was like I was being a great practitioner, right? Prescribing all of these cleanses for myself, for my clients. But I was making myself worse because I was constantly restricting more and more foods. And I didn't really look at the fact that 43 kilograms is a very low amount of lean mass for someone who's 5'9". So now that I've restored function and I do eat enough food, I actually have 50, the last scan I had 51 kilos of lean mass. So I have 8 kilos more mass than I did when I was under eating. So yes, at the moment I have body fat, but my goal is now to lose the body fat and maintain the lean mass. Actually, I'd like to put on a couple of kilos more lean mass, but therefore my goal weight, and it makes perfect sense to me, is going to be like 10 kilos heavier than what I used to weigh, 8 to 10 kilos heavier than what I used to weigh. So the recommendations for my height, remember I said I'm 5'9". The recommendations for my height are between 63 to 68 kilos. So I would definitely weigh 68 kilos with that amount of muscle mass and sit at 20 to 25 body percent easily. And I would probably look better. I will look better. I know I will look better, but I won't look 10 kilos heavier than what I was before. I'm not going to be fat. I'm probably going to look way more toned, actually, and athletic. And this is what is really key in working with people when we're looking at health issues, is making sure they eat enough and that they have adequate, like enough lean mass and that their body composition fits in with what we're trying to achieve with their health. So I really like to point people to look towards, when they're looking at research and what works in terms of eating enough, fat loss as opposed to weight loss, all of the things, is to look at the studies done on athletes, not on general population people. So the problem with looking at general population is that most people in those studies are obese. And we know that if you're eating a massive amount of junk food and you take someone off the junk food, so you take carbohydrates out, for instance, they're going to lose weight. Because if they were eating junk food, they would have been eating a massive amount of carbohydrates. You take the carbohydrates out, you put them into a massive calorie deficit, they're going to lose weight. So pretty much anything you do to that category of people will work in terms of weight loss. When we look at athletes, however, what we're seeing massively with athletes is low energy availability, LEA. We're seeing REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, and LCA, low carbohydrate availability. So these are people who have lean mass, or mostly have lean mass, but their goal is performance. And so we're looking at what's happening to their performance relative to their caloric intake, relative to their body mass and body composition. This is the research we want to look at. I think people fail to understand that if you train every day, you could be akin to an athlete, or at least halfway to where an athlete should be. And so therefore, this is the research you should be looking at, and this is the research that we should be applying to ourselves. So in sports science research, we know that fasting, for example, causes muscle loss. They applied a fasting study to a group of athletes. They all lost significant muscle mass, so they pulled the study pretty quickly. So this is the thing when we look at weight loss with athletes, we're always looking at fat loss, not scale weight loss. So a lot of the obese studies are looking at scale weight loss and not looking at muscle mass loss. As an athlete, you never want to give up muscle mass because that's your powerhouse. That's what makes you an athlete, and that's what makes you perform. What we're also looking at with athletes as well, Dr. Phil Campbell was looking at this. It's more looking at as well, like what body composition helps you perform the best at certain sports. And it's not always having super, super, super low body fat. You know, we have sometimes people are more genetically predispositioned to carry a little bit more body fat, and they might have better hormone function with a little bit more body fat. They might have better recovery with a little bit more body fat. I really like reading his research. Is really into looking at performance relative to body composition. So we're not always making the assumption that low body weight is always better or low fat mass is better. So we're looking at as well with athletes is that we can't survive without carbohydrate. Performance, so this low carbohydrate ability and relative energy deficiency in sport comes from mostly a lack of carbohydrate and a lack of fuel. And we're even looking at long distance runners, there's a lot of research to suggest that they might need 300 to 500 grams more carbohydrate than other athletes. And it's really interesting, right, because most of the long distance runners that I work with eat the least amount of food, because one of the adaptations with long distance and endurance sport is being already low energy availability and then pushing the metabolic rate down even further as the body tries to compensate for the lack of fuel coming in, so it slows everything down. And so they genuinely tend to be people who are really thin and can go for a long time without fuel. And I think Libby Westcomb's a really interesting person to look at with this, because she's been doing quite a bit of endurance training herself and testing it on herself. And she has been eating more carbohydrate to make up for the change in the energy dynamic of her training, and has become quite successful quite quickly at endurance training. And she's now working with some athletes on it. So it's quite interesting to read what she has to say about it. So Then we have this combination, right, of people who are doing tons and tons of exercise because they want to get super skinny, and then they're not eating very much food. So your caloric output goes out or your caloric intake goes down. And so, a lot of times I've talked about, look, a general guideline for people is women should be eating at least 2,000 calories. Like no one should be eating less than 2,000 calories. But 2,000 calories could be a massive energy deficit for a lot of people, especially people who are training regularly. I'm not even talking about being an athlete. I'm just talking about training 3 or 4 days a week plus doing your steps. Like if you're going to 3 or 4 HIIT classes a week and you're doing 10,000 steps every day, 2,000 calories is not going to be enough for you unless you're like 4'9". So we can use different formulas to work out how much food someone should be eating. There's a lot of debate on this, and I'm actually going to do a separate podcast, I think, on just numbers and talking about what numbers we should be focusing on, but a formula to work out what your caloric intake should be. Some people will say 45 calories times lean mass. Some people will say 45 calories times total body weight. So let's just take me for example. So let's just say my goal weight is 68 kilos. 68 times 45 is about 3,060 calories. I personally would struggle to eat that much, but I can see how I could eat that much maybe one day eventually. I don't necessarily agree with forcing yourself to eat that much. I know that Ash and Sarah, the Strong Sisters, just went through a process of increasing their calories up to 2,900 calories a day. And I think they're both around 5'4", 5'6". So it's a lot of food. But when I look at myself in comparison to them, I sit down at a computer all day. I do my 10,000 steps and I go to the gym and I sit down at a computer all day. Those two are running a farm, which is intense labor every day. If I say, okay, so my muscle mass is 52 kilos times 45, that's 2,340 calories. That's actually less than what I eat. I know Libby Westcombe said 45 times 50, your body mass, your lean mass, 52 kilos times 50, which is what she eats. And for me, that's 2,600, which is pretty much what I eat. I think there's some nuance to it. And this is where if you want to get really finite with the numbers, you want to work with a coach and do it. Same thing goes though, if you're listening to this and you're like, the best thing to do if you're underweight is to challenge yourself and go and take a food log and see how much you're eating. And then have a look at your recommended height and weight and what your recommended calories should be and see how far off you are from that. And this would be a really good indicator as to why you have so many health issues if you're living in a constant caloric deficit. So when I look back at my old Instagram, Facebook, great, right, because I took so many photographs of what I used to eat. And actually when I discovered pro-metabolic eating, I took an extensive food log and I could see that I would only eat 1,800, 2,000 calories a day pretty easily, whereas I need 2,600. But I can see how I would have needed 3,000 when I was working as a PT and on the gym floor all day and loading my car and unloading my car, and I never sat down. So it's really important to get that specific number and then gradually build up your calories over time. When you are underweight, you're going to have to accept that you're going to put on weight and that you're going to put on fat mass. Like I was trying to explain to someone the other day. So say, okay, 58 kilos and I was 20% fat. Well, 20% of 68 is more than 20% of 58. So I'm going to put on a couple of kilos of fat as well as I work up to my goal weight. But I mostly want to be putting on organ mass and skeletal mass from increasing food and increasing the health and density of my organs, and also through changing my program from doing 5 or 6 classes of HIIT a week to actually doing a strength program with progressive overload. So I'm increasing my lean mass as well. Some people need to increase their caloric intake by like 50 calories a week, especially when it comes to increasing carbohydrates when we've been on a low carb diet. And then what I would be doing is weighing myself every day. Also acknowledging that as a female, my weight can fluctuate 1 to 2 kilos in my cycle. So, around ovulation and around my period, I can be like 2 kilos heavier. So not to freak out when I'm ovulating and go, oh my God, I'm 2 kilos heavier, I'm eating too much food. But rather look at the whole month and see the trend of the whole month and increase accordingly. And know that you are going to increase in 6 to 8 kilos. So putting on a kilo, maybe you're going to increase weight 5 kilos or whatever it is. You really need to get comfortable with that and know that if you put on 500 grams here and there, it's probably a good thing. If you put a kilo here and there, it's a good thing. It's probably best to work with a coach to help you do that. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot with people who are underweight, which is really scary, is low bone mineral density. And I'm noticing a really big trend on the internet at the moment with people trying to increase their bone mineral density, thin women trying to increase their bone mineral density. And they look really good and well-intentioned with what they're doing. Like they're putting on weight vests and walking and increasing Pilates and increasing weights and all of the things. But the problem is that if we do not increase our caloric intake, we're always going to be eating ourselves to make fuel. And that includes pulling minerals out of your bones. So it's a bit of a trend at the moment. And it's also like focusing on the high protein foods. Now, high protein is really important, but like 1.6 grams to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight, depending on the person and their physical activity, is more than enough. We don't need to go over that. We do know as well from studies that when you do not eat enough carbohydrate, your body takes the protein and turns it into carbohydrate. And what we can measure is the loss of nitrogen. So we're not actually getting all the nutrients from the protein that we need and utilizing, we're actually wasting them away. So you're kind of eating all that excessive protein for no reason. So carbohydrates are protein sparing. So having enough carbohydrate means that you'll actually be able to utilize the protein that you eat. Carbohydrate also is stored in the muscles as muscle glycogen. We cannot, and our muscles are fueled by glycogen. So we cannot actually grow muscle without adequate carbohydrate intake. So all of these people, I actually looked at a few of these women who were saying they had problems with bone mineral density, and I've been looking at their programs, and I think I'm going to analyze them and put them in some posts for people to see. They're extremely low in calories. They're extremely low in carbohydrate. I feel for these women, but I feel like I have to disclose this because they are not going to increase their bone mineral density from wearing weighted vests. And all of them have talked about how they've hit their 30s and had to do extra things to lose weight. Now, all of a sudden at their 30s and they've got their body weight back down, like lost 10, 20 pounds, which I want to talk about in a moment. But, I don't think people realize the severity of this issue with bone mineral density and low body weight people. Or they do, they just say they kind of go hand in hand, but they're still not saying to women, you actually need to eat more food and you need to put on muscle mass. And you can't put on muscle mass just from walking around in a weighted vest. You need to do a strength training program and implement progressive overload. Yes, you could see some differences. I'd have to look into the actual research with the weighted vest to tell you how much you could implement change with a weighted vest, but it would need to be alongside adequate nutrition. So somewhere around that 45 calories per kilo of lean mass at least per day, and also having adequate lean mass as well. So remember how I said I used to have 43 kilos of lean mass and now I have 51 kilos of lean mass. So that was my last DEXA scan. Hopefully this one I've gone up to 53. Please cross my fingers. But you need to increase your lean mass significantly to increase your bone mineral density if you're sitting in that underweight category. I was underweight. I was severely underweight. I'm so glad I got into this before I had challenges with my bone mineral density. But it is just completely ignorant for any coach or doctor to tell someone that they can increase their bone mineral density just by wearing a weighted vest. I've been drawn to, or this woman's popped up in my Instagram feed, and I went down a bit of a rabbit hole looking at her. And she actually had a severe spinal injury because she had such low bone mineral density. And one of her arguments was that I've been lifting weights my whole entire life, so I should have really good bone mineral density, but I don't. So it's obviously just genetic. And so I started looking into this woman a lot more. She's very, very low body weight. She does a lot of bodybuilding, and so she's constantly dieting and restricting and sitting in this low body weight. And she, I would say, has an unhealthy fascination with this low body weight. I was looking at the food she was eating. It was extremely low in calories. Then she had babies and had diastasis recti, which is when the fascia between the rectus abdominis splits. It happens to most pregnant women. The severity of it is different in different scenarios. But she had experienced quite severe diastases, and then she also had a hiatal hernia. So she had a lot of abdominal wall trauma, and she went to do a Smith machine squat, and she only had like 30 or 40 pounds on the bar, and she went down to the bottom of the squat, and she felt one of her vertebra actually snapped and compressed her spinal cord, and she collapsed under the weight of that. And a piece of her vertebrae, or the spinous processes, actually shattered and pierced her spinal cord and severed her spinal cord. She is now paraplegic from the waist down. And it's a tragic story, and I'm really sorry for her. And now she has gone back into bodybuilding as a para-athlete, but she's still doing the same behaviors that she did before, the extreme dieting and, all of the things. And we are missing the point here, because the point is that she had low bone mineral density in the first place because she's undereaten her whole entire life. And I'm seeing this happen more and more and more and more with people who come to me with low bone mineral density, and we go through a history of what have they eaten for lunch. I had one woman who came to me and she actually was losing her teeth. Her bone mineral density was so poor, she was losing her teeth. And when I spoke to her, she had a very long history of health issues, and one of her huge drivers in life was to maintain a low body weight. And she would have a smoothie for breakfast, a salad for lunch, and lean protein and vegetables for dinner. And I reckon she probably ate 1,500 calories most of her life. She had 9. She could never fall pregnant, which is another big red flag. And she had IVF. She had 9 miscarriages. And she finally got her baby on her 10th round, and then went into menopause straight after having her baby. And the blame for the bone mineral density was perimenopause and the lack of estrogen, which is hilarious because you're given so much estrogen when you go through IVF to force you to ovulate. So, it's a huge red flag that no one ever in her entire life said to her, what do you eat every day? And even if most doctors wouldn't think it was a bad thing, only eating 1,500 calories a day. But what a sad story for this woman, and I'm seeing this more and more and more. Now, it is something to be aware of. Like, as we go into menopause, again, Dr. Bill Campbell is looking at this research. Dr. Stacey Sims is amazing in this space as well, is that there is a natural change in body composition. We stay the same weight. The research says we stay the same weight, but we lose muscle mass and we gain fat mass. Now, as you lose muscle mass, your metabolic rate goes down, right? So this is really important. And this is why these people can maintain such a low body weight, because they have the low muscle tone, so they weigh less, low organ tone, but also the consequence of that is a low basal metabolic rate. The bigger the organs, the bigger the muscles, the higher the metabolic rate. So your metabolic rate drops and you get to this, what these women are all doing, saying is, I'm in my 30s now and all of a sudden I started putting on body fat. So I had to do extra things to combat this excess body fat. Now, what they've all done in these programs is that they have all gone harder on the fat loss and pushed themselves to lose more weight. So they actually are thinner now than before. And to achieve that same look that they did in their 20s and 30s, they actually have to weigh even less than they did in their 20s and 30s because of this natural progression in perimenopause and menopause where we lose muscle mass and store more body fat. So I'm interested, because the blame, of course, is that it's low estrogen. We're losing estrogen when actually, in fact, in perimenopause, the beginning of perimenopause is actually when we have the highest amount of estrogen, and it doesn't drop off till much later. So, more research needs to be done into this, but I would argue that a lot of the reasons why we have such a high incidence of low bone mineral density is their relationship with muscle mass. It has to be putting on more muscle mass. I mean, that's why they tell all these women to wear the weight vests, is to increase their muscle mass. And we know that, the weight increases bone mineral density. It's the loss of muscle mass as we age that comes with all of the caloric restriction as well. So, as we age, we actually need to be focusing more and more on increasing our muscle mass. And we might actually weigh more on the scale as a result of that and as a result of menopause, but we'll probably actually look better. I think we also need to talk about visceral fat because this is also coming up as increasing in menopause as well. And there's one doctor who's been talking about it a lot, that she's seeing it a lot in her skinny patients. They actually have an increase in visceral fat. Now, visceral fat is the unhealthy fat. It's the fat that surrounds our organs. And what they've looked at in anorexics is that they actually increase visceral fat very quickly in the refeeding process. If the refeed isn't done in a very strategic and controlled manner, what visceral fat does is increase the warmth of your organs. So in an underfed state, and they saw this in the Minnesota starvation experiment, and looking at autopsies of Holocaust victims, etc., they had an increase in visceral fat because when our metabolism works really well, we create heat. It's the energy that creates heat in our body. When energy is getting into the cell, glucose and oxygen is getting into the cell, we create body heat. And this is why our body temperature will be 36.7, 98.4 degrees. This lack of heat, the body goes into a preservation mode. It needs to keep these organs warm and it needs to keep them alive. And so it will store visceral fat, wrap fat around the organs to keep them warm. Obviously, the problem with visceral fat, it is the unhealthy fat that will eventually give you issues. And this particular menopause doctor is seeing a high incidence of that. And I would argue, is it really menopause, or is it that we have such low body weight and we have to strive for even lower body weight in menopause because of these body composition changes and people not focusing enough on putting on muscle mass? So we have a lot of people who are skinny fat. This is what's called skinny fat. And this is where I really want you to think as well, because the fitness industry has a lot to account for this. I can't tell you how many women I've worked with who go to an F45 or one of those chain kind of gyms, and they get measured on a gym body scan, and the personal trainer will say to them, well, you have 30% body fat and you need to lose body fat. So let's get you on a diet and let's get you on an extreme exercise regime. Now, I have been, like I said to you before, I should be between 63 and 68 kilos. I have been at 65 kilograms with 30% body fat. And I know what it feels like to look in the mirror. But what actually needs to happen for most of those people, if they sit in the healthy body weight range for their height, they need to actually put on muscle mass and change their body composition. Now, people will say that muscle weighs more than fat. It doesn't. 1 kilo of muscle and 1 kilo of fat weigh the same amount. The difference is that 1 kilo of muscle takes up like half the amount of space that 1 kilo of fat does. So you look much, much smaller when you have more muscle mass relative to fat mass. So if you can stay at 65 kilos and decrease your fat mass while increasing your muscle mass, you will look much, much smaller but stay at 65 kilos. And this is where people need a lot more education. There's not enough education in the personal training industry. There's not enough education in the medical industry. It's just seen as, well, you've got 30% body fat, you need to drop body fat. And I don't just see this with women. I see it with men all the time. They're like, I can't see my abs and I want to be able to see my abs, so I need to lose body fat. And quite often it's, no, you actually need to put on some muscle so that we can see them, or we need to commit to eating a healthy, wholesome, nutrient-dense diet and fueling ourselves so that we can put on muscle. And then you will see the muscle. And also, I should say as well, most people think that we swap. We don't swap fat for muscle or swap muscles for fat. They are stored in two different places. They operate in completely different ways. But the more muscle mass we have, the more fat we will burn at rest. So if you are in a healthy weight range for your height, if you put muscle mass on, you will lose body fat. And you can do this at maintenance calories. And so if you're someone who has got low energy availability, you have realized that you're eating too little calories and that you are in fact underweight, you slowly increase your calories over time. You will put on some fat, and you might put on a kilo or two of fat first, and that's okay. So you'll increase your fat mass slowly. But what you're trying to do is increase your muscle mass. So as you're increasing your calories up to maintenance, you're going to increase your strength training. You're going to adopt a program with progressive overload where the training gets harder each session. And so we're constantly increasing the load and the tension on the muscles. That's how they grow. And we're constantly increasing the food at the same time, not just the protein, but the carbs as well. Then you will increase your muscle mass and you will lose fat mass at the same time. If you're underweight and you will put some fat on at the same time, you might put on 2 kilos of fat and put 4 kilos of muscle on, for example, and that will still be healthy. Remember that 20% of 68 kilos is more than 20% of 58 kilos. So how do you work out your body composition? Start with looking at the guide. I'll put it up in my Instagram. Start with having a look at the guide. How do you work out your caloric intake? You start with 45 times body weight. If you're underweight, I would start with 45 times body weight for sure. But I would take a very clear log over 2 weeks of your caloric intake. 2 weeks because most people don't eat consistently. So you need to take 2 weeks and then average out the caloric intake. So take the 14 days, add it all together, divide it by 14, get the average caloric intake. And from that low calorie intake, it will be lower than what you have been told that you should be eating. So you could go to the tdee.net calculator, put in your height, your weight, your activity. It will tell you what you should weigh and it will tell you what you should eat to weigh that much. You're going to then need a strategy to go from the low caloric intake to the desired caloric intake. And some people need to add 50 calories at a time per week, per month, and see how they go. I want to warn you, if you haven't been eating carbohydrates and you add carbohydrates in, you will feel really good. That doesn't mean you need to keep going. It means you need to stick to that 50 calories, enjoy that feeling, and then wait for the next week to add the next 50 calories, because if you add too quickly, you will put on fat mass, because you can't go from eating zero carbohydrate to just eating more carbohydrate. When you don't eat carbohydrate for a long time, you rely on glycogen as a fuel source, which will increase your insulin, your susceptibility to insulin resistance, because when you don't have carbohydrates, insulin doesn't have anything to do, so it will downregulate. The insulin receptor doesn't respond, and so your body needs to get a little bit of carbohydrate, have some insulin response, have the insulin push the carbohydrate into the muscles. You help that happen by training in a specific way, training in strength training, specific cardio to help you get into utilizing carbohydrates again properly. Then when that started working well, then you add a little bit more carbohydrate, etc. And at the same time, you probably need to be lowering fat at the same time. Generally, people who undereat tend to eat a lot of fat because fat's very satiating and it helps you eat less and less, especially if you're not eating carbs. So there's quite a lot of nuance to look at. But I highly encourage you to look at this. I know it's hard. I know it's really hard. Like, I remember when I was thin, I was so identified with the way that I looked, and women who are thin will tell me that. I was so sure of myself that I actually ate a shit ton of food, and I could at certain times eat a lot of food, but then I could also go for really long periods without food. And if you're really struggling from health issues, especially gut issues, period issues, you've been told you have low bone mineral density, you don't sleep that well, your hair, you have issues with your hair being full and luscious and just anything, I implore you to sit down and have a look at what your body composition should be, and have a look at what your caloric intake is, and then have a look at it relative to what it should be, and start taking care of yourself. There's a lot of emotional work that needs to be done in terms of cutting the cords with that idea of what you should look like, especially if you're someone like me who had a career where I was getting paid to look like that. And there's a lot of stuff that we need to do in terms of like social media. Like, it's so hard when you open social media, like it's just full of size 6 Australian, size 0 US people, and they look bigger than they are in real life. Like, when I see some of these people in real life, I'm surprised. I'm like, oh my God, they're like little sticks. In real life, a lot of these people don't look healthy, and you don't see a lot of these people in real life. And also to watch out when you're watching these people online. It's interesting how I see how they'll have constant skin struggles, for example, and they'll have a whole, like this one influencer I was looking at, she is my height, 5'9", and she's 58 kilos and constantly justifying this low body weight with her health routine. But then she has a whole highlights reel on all of the things that she does to keep her skin great, and all the facials and the products and all of the things. And I can tell you, from someone who used to have skin issues, who now eats enough food, I literally just wash my face with one cleanser, the Cautionary cleanser, and I put moisturizer on. That's it. That's all I do to my skin. I do nothing else. And my skin is the best that it's ever been, because our skin, everything in our body, needs energy to function. We shouldn't have to have these excessive routines to maintain ourselves. Like, obviously I'm not saying like if you want to wear makeup and you want to spend an hour doing your makeup every morning and you just like wearing makeup, that's fine. But I just am really wary of when we have to cover up our skin because it's so bad, or we have to, invest in all this self-care and so much time and money into parts of ourselves, and not, even just the digestive cleansers or the gut issues, and having to cut up multiple, major food groups, or having a reaction every time we go on holiday, having a reaction every time we go out for dinner, and we're not in our normal environment. Like, a lot of the reasons that happens, and I've seen this with clients a lot, is you don't eat very much during the week, and then you go out on the weekend and you will eat a normal amount of food. And what happens is, when that low energy availability from the entire week of not eating, you get low digestive enzyme production, low gut motility, And then you go and put all of this food in, and the body's like, I don't know what to do with that. That is just way too much for me to deal with. And so you get the bloating and you get the gas and all the issues. And it's not what you ate. It's generally that you don't have enough energy to deal with what you ate because it's so much more food than you eat on a day-to-day basis. So what you actually need to do is increase your day-to-day intake and then maybe eat a little bit less when you go out, not binge so much, which you probably won't do when you're not so hungry from starving yourself all week, unintentionally, of course. There's a lot of nuance with this whole low body weight thing and the social aspect. I mean, even just looking at a catalogue to try and buy myself clothes or bras, like every woman in a catalogue is a size 6 or an 8, and every woman above that is a plus size. And I can tell you now that I don't think I'll be smaller than a size 10 when I get to my goal weight. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think I'm going to look better. And, it's making a lot of peace with that size 10, size 12 for a lot of people is a perfectly normal size. It's a healthy size that actually a size 6 or an 8 is an underweight. It's an underfed person's size. I used to model and I used to be on fashion shoots and backstage and fashion parades. And I can tell you now, I've never seen a model who eats enough food. Never, ever. Like no one eats when we're working because we're all scared of getting bloated and, having reactions to everything. So we definitely don't eat when we're working. But imagine like being at Paris Fashion Week. Like I was never this kind of high model, but you're basically in back-to-back shows for like 10 days or 2 weeks or something. You just don't eat. You just eat salads every day and juices, and you're trying to eat as little food as possible so you don't get bloated or whatever. These habits just continue on and on. Like I've never met someone who is model skinny who ate consistently a lot of food. They might eat a lot at a dinner, like at the end of fashion week, and go and have a big dinner and really pig out, or, and that's another thing too. It's this pigging out, this binging is actually a result of being so hungry from not eating for a very long time, or not eating all week. And then you go out. I mean, I remember like speaking to people, they never eat bread and they'll have a piece of bread and they can't stop and they eat the whole loaf. And then they'll have a reaction because there's literally a loaf of bread sitting in their stomach, and they'll say to me, I can't eat bread. I'm just so reactive to eating bread. It's like, well, no, it's that you ate an entire loaf of bread when you haven't eaten bread for a month, and your body can't cope with that much fiber, that much grain. Maybe just have one piece of bread and then up it to one piece of bread every second day or half a piece of bread every second day and see how you go with that first before we make this assumption that it's just the bread. Often it's just a low energy availability state from constantly undereating and having a lack of digestive capability due to the lack of energy. And so every food irritates you and upsets you, especially fibrous food. So I'm going to stop there because I'm going to get a little bit over passionate about this. I get so passionate about it because it is the most overlooked problem in health issues. And what you would have noticed from listening to my other podcasts on body weight, especially in the obesity one, I work with women who are obese and they're not eating anything because they're in this restrict binge cycle, or they've restricted so many times and done so many diets that they actually have such a low metabolic rate now. They can't eat enough food, yet they're still high body weight. So they have all these digestive issues too. This is a seriously underlooked part of health issues, being underfed, the low energy availability state, the whole thing with relative energy deficiency in sport, low carbohydrate intake. These are all things that contribute to unhealthy states and symptoms in the body. I hope this podcast is helpful today. I actually wrote a whole bunch of notes and I didn't stick to them. So please let me know. If I waffled on too much today and I need to rein it in, please let me know. I will. I found this topic a little bit more challenging to talk about. I am honestly, if I'm going to be 100% honest, as a person, not as a coach, I'm still working on having been this state for so long in my entire life and what that's meant for my long-term health. I'm still working on forgiving myself and, forgiving the medical industry and the fitness industry and everyone for pushing this low body weight ideal onto people. And I'm also have a heightened sensitivity to it as well, I think, because in my age group, women are, all my in real life friends, well, not all of them, but a lot of them are really pushing again for that low body weight. And, I think I still have work to do on myself to forgive myself and not be triggered by the whole industry and that whole push by social media and the fashion industry, etc. So thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've taken away something, or maybe there's a friend that needs to hear this and would benefit from hearing this. I'd love for you to share it with them. And as always, please rate, subscribe, and review my podcast. It would mean so much to me. I am loving the comments that I'm getting and the reviews that I'm getting. It means so much to me. Honestly, I can't tell you how much it means to me. But I will see you next time on The Body Never Lies.
I'm Leila Lutz, and you've been listening to The Body Never Lies. If you haven't yet, please go to your favourite podcast app and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. All the resources and references from this episode are waiting for you on my website, leilalutz.com. Just click on podcast and look for this episode. Now join me next week for another episode of The Body Never Lies. Thank you so much for listening.
Free.